Okay, continuing with the theme that yes, it's rocket science, it is my pleasure to introduce JPL Fellow and Emmy Award winning documentary producer Blaine Baggett, and he's going to tell us about something about the history of rocket science, and the talk is titled Rocket Science and the Human Imagination. So, Blaine.
So is this the clicker? Yep. Good morning. I want to thank the AGU and particularly Rosaly for having me here. It's my first experience at AGU, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I want to start by talking about this man. His name is Scott Kelly. And 3.5 years ago, about 250 miles above us, he woke up one morning just before the end of his time on this particular mission, which was almost a year long. He spent more time in space on one mission than any other American astronaut. And he found a few minutes that day to write a personal email to someone who had a profound impact on his life. It wasn't a teacher, it wasn't a member of his family, it wasn't a former astronaut, it wasn't John Glenn, it wasn't Neil Armstrong, but it was someone who had written a book. And when he was 18 years old, flunking out of college, he went into a bookstore and picked up a copy of the book, and it changed his life. He knew then what he wanted to do. He wanted to be an astronaut. He had stumbled upon the right stuff. And the writer, of course, was Tom Wolfe. And Wolfe responded to Kelly that very same day, emailed him back, and later they would have a chat while Kelly was still in orbit. And in that conversation, Wolfe encouraged Scott, when he returned back to Earth, to write a book about his experiences. And he did. And the book is called Endurance. And it's a terrific book. If you've not read it, run down the bookstore and get it. It is the most candid book I've ever read about an astronaut's journey. And I think, I know how Scott Kelly felt about Tom Wolfe, because I once also picked up a copy of The Right Stuff, and I loved the energy of his writing and his repetitive but never dull use of phrases like, "Our rockets always blow up," punctuated with multiple exclamation points. And after reading The Right Stuff, I knew what I wanted to do. I had to make a documentary about space. Now, for me, this was a crazy thing to do. I had a great job in Washington, working at the PBS network as their creative director. But I was obsessed. So I quit my job, and by hook and crook, raised the money to produce for PBS a series called Spaceflight. It was the first nationally broadcast TV series to span what was then the arc of the American space program. This was 1985, nearly 35 years ago, and it was well received by the public and the critics alike. The Washington Post wrote of the series, "This is the real stuff. We wonder, watching this, will we ever stretch so tall again?" So the trajectory of my career of communicating about space was put in motion by reading a book. And by the way, I got to meet and interview Tom Wolfe in his Manhattan townhouse for the series. Now, I share these two personal stories about The Right Stuff to illustrate the power and the grip that storytelling can have on our lives. Stories can be spoken, they can be written, they can be filmed, they can even be physically built. And today we're going to consider some examples of all of these as they relate to rockets and space travel. And we'll explore how they have caused the human imagination to soar. No less an authority than Albert Einstein weighed in on the importance of the imagination. He declared it to be more important than knowledge. He viewed knowledge as ever evolving, but having at the same time fixed boundaries. In his view, what was largely responsible for the expansion of knowledge was human imagination. And we can see this in how Einstein went about working about his revolutionary theories. He didn't start with mathematical formulas. In fact, he wasn't even all that fond of math. His starting point was to create a thought experiment, imagining and visualizing situations that involve relationships of time, space, gravity, velocity. Einstein was theoretical, Thomas Edison was practical. But Edison put a premium on the imagination. All that is needed to be an inventor, he once said, was a good imagination and a pile of junk. I don't know how much junk there was in his lab, but I do know that among his accomplishments was being an early pioneer in the creation of movies. And just think how inspirational movies about space have been. And speaking of movies, we're also going to spend some time with Walt Disney. This is what he had to say about the role of imagination. If you can dream it, you can do it. And then he joked, remember, this whole thing was started by a mouse. But before there was an Einstein, an Edison, a Disney, or a Tom Wolfe, there was this man, the French writer Jules Verne. Many consider him the father of the genre we now call science fiction. He's best known for books like The Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days. Only Shakespeare ranks ahead of him as the world's most translated writer. But after these most famous books had been written, he wrote one in 1865 that is not really as well known, but it may have been one that has had the most lasting impact. It is called From the Earth to the Moon. It is set in the United States at the end of the American Civil War. And some of the events of this book closely match what happened a century later with Apollo 11, that to me, they're so similar that it's a little bit spooky. For instance, in the book, 3 people are launched to the moon from Florida. Their spacecraft, a giant artillery shell, resembles in shape and size the Apollo command module. And Verne called this module the Columbiad. The Apollo 11 spacecraft, you may recall, was named Columbia. And after returning from the moon, the landing site was, as with Apollo 11, the Pacific Ocean. Now, these similarities were not lost on the Apollo 11 crew. During their return home, Neil Armstrong actually spoke about Jules Verne and his impact. So it's just one indication of how writing can have a great impact on us. And almost every rocket scientist we're about to meet begins with a story of Jules Verne having an impact on their career. Now, besides writing, there are other forms of artistic expression that were inspired by Jules Verne. In the United States, in 2001, the ideal of a rocket trip to the moon was turned to a major attraction in the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Now, you may not remember this exhibition. If anything, it's probably remembered most because it was where President William McKinley was assassinated. It was a dark moment in an otherwise optimistic endeavor. It was the beginning of a new century, and the exposition's main focus, its purpose, was to show off advances in technology at the beginning of the century with an emphasis on the harnessing of electricity. And to make that point, the entire park at night was ablaze with lights, making for a spectacular sight witnessed by millions of people and filmed by Thomas Edison. Now, the expedition's trip to the moon was housed in a 40,000 square foot building. Taking the trip cost twice as much as any other event, 50 cents. But then again, it was a trip to the moon. Close to 500,000 people ponied up the $50 to have the experience, including Thomas Edison. And the experience began by being ushered into an ornate lobby that could have rivaled the Paris Opera House. And in the waiting room, passengers were briefed on what to expect on their journey. Then, 30 at a time, they boarded a spaceship named Lune that resembled a giant blimp with wings. And as the spacecraft took off, behind-the-scenes workers and pulleys were used to flap the wings, while fans were used to create the sensation of fast-moving winds. But Lune didn't move at all. What did move were the canvas screens on either side of the spaceship, painted with scenes first of the sky, then scenes of the perspective of Buffalo, and then below them, then the twinkling stars, and finally images of the moon, and the lunar craft would land. Also, there were sound effects. They landed in a crater, and then the immersive part of the experience began. The passengers stepped off their spacecraft and were met by actors, small actors, children, and they served as guides through the geological features of the exhibit. The experience ended with passengers being fed into a gift shop, just like you find today at all the attraction parks. Now, I don't know if Walt Disney knew about this Buffalo expedition, but I wouldn't be surprised, because when Disneyland opened in 1955, it featured its own trip to the moon, which was also spun off, as you see, into a game. And the ride was located next to the tallest structure in the park, a rocket called the TWA Moonliner. TWA, if you don't know, was once an airline company owned by Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire. And the Moonliner served as a visual beacon for visitors in the area of the park known as Tomorrowland. And adjacent to the rocket was their version of Flight to the Moon, where, like back in Buffalo, the visitors were treated to a simulated ride to the moon. Now, the Moonliner rocket that you see is just 1/3 scale of what was envisioned by its inventor to be a real nuclear-powered rocket that would return to Earth, landing vertically, tail first. And who was thinking of a nuclear-powered rocket capable of landing straight in the 1950s? Wernher von Braun. And we'll meet with him shortly, but for the moment, take note of the similarity between the Moonliner and his World War II V2. Now, after the Apollo astronauts actually went to the moon, the experience was reimagined as Mission to Mars, and the last flight to the Red Planet from Disneyland took off in 1992. And now, alas, even Mission to Mars is no longer. It is instead a building that is home to the Pizza Planet, whose motto is delivering refreshment to a thirsty planet. Of course, long before Disneyland, Walt Disney was making films. They weren't all about Mickey Mouse. One of his first live-action films was a Jules Verne book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So since we're talking about films now, let's go dive into them a bit deeper. What's regarded as the first science fiction film can be traced, at least in part, its inspiration, in part, to Jules Verne. It's called Le Voyage dans la Lune, or A Trip to the Moon. This highly theatrical French movie follows a group of astronomers. I don't think any of these were actual astronomers, but the supporting cast, who traveled to the moon. It was an international sensation when it came out, especially in the United States. And as you can see, some copies of the film were actually colorized, one of the first times that this was ever done. Even today, A clip from the movie of the rocket hitting the moon is considered by film scholars to be one of the most iconic images in the entire history of cinema. In fact, The Village Voice ranks A Trip to the Moon among the top 100 films of all time. Now, I think it's apparent to you that just from seeing a couple of frames of this film that it is enveloped in fantasy. One critic called it the Star Wars of its day. But another film, nearly made in Germany about 3 decades later, was much more realistic in the possibilities, which reminds me more of what Stanley Kubrick did with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And for the journey that we're on, this movie has special significance. Frau dem Mond, Woman on the Moon, was made by Fritz Lang. He has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He grew up in Vienna in a home that was well stocked with books by, you guessed it, Jules Verne. The plot is really your typical good guy, bad guy, looking for money on gold on the moon. But that's not really of any importance to us. What is important is that Fritz Lang recruited a technical advisor to be in his film, to work on it. His name was Hermann Oberth. And 6 years before being approached by Lang, he had taken his rejected PhD thesis on rockets, which his professors had decided was implausible, and turned it into a book. And the book helped to really spawn rocketry in Germany in the 1930s. And Fritz wanted to make this film as realistic as possible, and he asked Oberth to design the film sets, and realistic they were. Look at this frame from the film. See how closely the rocket resembles the shape and size of the space shuttle? And just imagine how transfixed moviegoers would have been to see such a sight in 1929. And by the way, among those attending the premiere was Albert Einstein. And see what's behind the building. Oberth is showing us in 1929 that what has to be built first in order to build a large rocket. It's almost as if you've ever been to Cape Kennedy and seen the vehicle assembly building. It's the blueprint for it. I also found it interesting to learn that in this film, there is a countdown from 10 to 0. That's where that tradition comes from. And in the film, the rocket rises out of a pool of water. Another realistic touch, given that water is used for sound suppression to protect rockets when they're being launched. And it's a multi-stage rocket, a prediction of how large rockets would have to be built. The technical details were so impressive that when the Nazis came to power, they banned the film, thinking it revealed too much about how to build a real rocket. But before it was banned, Germany's having a very big, serious case of rocket fever. For instance, the automobile maker Fritz von Opel decided to strap a cluster of rockets on the back of one of his race cars and let it rip. And he set a new world record of 143 miles per hour. Not being done with that, he decided afterwards to strap some rockets onto a glider and actually achieved the first rocket gliding experience. It went for something like 72 seconds before setting down. Now, all this resulted in this rocket fever and clubs being established. And one of them was called, translated, the Society for Space Travel, and Hermann Oberth was one of the members. So was that fellow, Werner von Braun. This is how he got his start, and when the Nazis banned all research, he was offered the chance to work with the military. They would pay for the German army would pay for his schooling. He got his PhD, which was later classified, and so he went to work with them full time. Then later, he became a member of the Nazi Party at age 25, and then after that, the SS component of that, all of which coincided with his climbing up the management ladder. He was considered as much of a really brilliant engineer that he was matched by marketing skills. And he would give Hitler face-to-face a pitch for what he wanted to do in building rockets. And Hitler was transfixed by the idea of having such a rocket, a modern weapon, that would have destructive power to destroy all of London. What I want, he told von Braun, was pounding his fist, is annihilation. And the rocket was, of course, the V-2. The V-2 was first flew in 1942. It had little in the way of guidance control. And in fact, it was only useful against large cities. And it only killed 3,000 people, which made it a major strategic military mistake. That's a kill ratio of only 3 people only for every V-2. The worst carnage with the V-2 had to do with how they were manufactured by concentration camp prisoners. More people died manufacturing it than were hit by it. Now, von Braun wasn't responsible for running the facility where the V-2s were built, but he was very much aware of what went on. And when the war ended, of course, he surrendered, along with many of his engineers and their V-2s, to the United States, who they considered the enemy of choice. They were transported to Texas, where they were able to shoot off their V-2s. There's the surrender. Now let's go, since we're in the United States, let's go to Robert Goddard, who began his research in 1912. He's considered the father of American rocketry, and for a change, his inspiration was not Jules Verne, it was H.G. Wells. By himself, he worked out the physics of rocket flight, and that was a very interesting thing, given how complicated this was. He understood that to build an efficient rocket, you needed to burn liquid fuel with a combustion chamber in order to increase the engine efficiency. And in 1936, a Caltech student, under the wing of Professor Theodore von Karman, Frank Molina, visited Goddard with hopes of trying to find some sort of collaboration. Goddard wasn't interested. And von Karman didn't take kindly to this, and he wrote about Goddard in his autobiography. He said, Goddard may have been the first to use a liquid rocket, but Goddard believed in secrecy. There's no direct line from Goddard to the present-day rocketry. He is on the branch that died. Now, the student, Frank Molina, would become the second director of JPL, and his branch would work much longer. And his story parallels that of von Braun in fascinating ways. To begin, they were born in the same year, and Molina also, of course, read Jules Verne. And as a Caltech graduate, he led a group of students and, shall we say, eccentrics, to begin doing rocket experiments at Caltech. That whole group became known as the Suicide Squad because of the unexpected explosions going on in their laboratory. And for that, they were banned to a nearby area from Pasadena, where they conducted their first rocket tests in 1936. And in order to support what they were doing, they would borrow equipment from the lab, go to junkyards, and rummage in other ways for money, including trying to write a Hollywood movie script that was a thinly disguised version of their own story. There were no takers. Now, this was a time of the Great Depression, and there were many, many ways that in a place like Caltech, people were thinking about, could there be a different economic model than capitalism? Was socialism, was communism a better way? And Frank Molina joined the Communist Party, as we now know, because of the work of a writer named Fraser McDonald, who's recently written a book revealing that Molina did actually become a card-carrying member. But at this point, storm clouds are gathering over about World War II, and Molina decides that what he must do is help the United States Army build a rocket. Going back. And these are the two rockets that were built at JPL basically during the war. The one you see, the one below is the private, which was worked on to almost the very end of the war, and then it was followed by, of course, the corporal. Now, they were rockets which were ultimately to be used, the corporal, as a ballistic missile that carried a nuclear warhead. And Molina wanted nothing to do with this. And so he concentrated on something called the WAC Corporal, which was a smaller rocket, but it was the world's first sounding rocket, which was used for science, which is what he wished to do. And one of the great ironies is that this WAC rocket was mated with a V2 and launched. In fact, the very first rocket to launch from Cape Canaveral was a V2 mated to the WAC Corporal, and it was called the bumper WAC. This occurred in 1950. By this time, Molina has long gone from the United States. He didn't want to do anything with building rockets for military purposes anymore, and he decided to move to Paris, where he worked for the United Nations. But there was another reason why he left. It was because the FBI knew about what he had done, and the Red Scare in the United States is underway, and so Molina actually becomes a fugitive when the United States declares him a fugitive and revokes his passport in 1952. And so, unable to work or to travel in Paris, he became what many people in Paris do. He became an artist. And the work that he did combined what he knew about physics and electronics with his interest in art, and he became very, very successful at doing this. Meanwhile, of course, in the United States, von Braun is becoming an American citizen. He moves and his people from Texas to Alabama, and he continues also to work on his marketing skills. He writes articles for Collier's magazines. He works with Walt Disney. In fact, he was the host of 3 films that were done, that were shown on television. And I love this about what he had to say, very revealing, I think. "I have to be a two-headed monster," he told Time magazine, "scientist and public relations man." But while he was advocating space exploration, at the same time to the Pentagon, he was advocating building an orbiting battle station capable of hurling down nuclear bombs. The nation that first reaches this goal would establish overwhelming priority over other nations. So, as we see one more time, JPL and von Braun are coupled together after Sputnik. Sputnik is launched. The United States tries to respond with Vanguard. It's a disaster. It blows up on the launch pad. And instead, JPL's rocket upper stage and the satellite Explorer 1 are mated with a von Braun rocket that gives the United States its first satellite in space and the world's first space discovery, the Van Allen radiation belts. Now, for a switch, that was then. Now, I look at today, and I never imagined I would live to see U.S. astronauts could only get into space by hitching a ride on a Russian spacecraft. I grew up during the Cold War, but that's where we are. And we're also on the verge of a new era, as NASA is poised to turn over a lot of its transportation to in terms of near Earth, to commercial enterprises. NASA's even talking about selling the space station. And another thing I never thought that I never would have imagined or to see was what von Braun had envisioned at Disneyland was a rocket actually landing side by side vertically. When I saw this with SpaceX having done this, I had trouble believing it was real. I almost wondered, is this a movie? And so, what has inspired Elon Musk to build rockets? And he says, you want to be inspired by things. You want to wake up in the morning and think the future is going to be great. And that's what being a spacefaring civilization is all about. Now, like von Braun, Musk is an amazing marketeer. And at times, he declares outrageous, outlandish goals. But he's delivered on some of them, if not necessarily on time. Last year, he launched his first Falcon Heavy rocket. It is, for right now, the world's most powerful rocket. It has twice the lift capacity of the space shuttle. And we've already seen the image of the Falcon Heavy boosters landing side by side, and the main stage was meant to land on a barge in the Atlantic. It missed that one, but they've now accomplished it. And here's the shot of the barge. When I first saw this, I thought, how clever to say that to the returning rocket, of course I love you. And the folks at SpaceX really, I thought, had a great sense of humor. And then I saw this one, which says on it, it's supposed to say, just read the instructions. Everything will be okay. Crazy, right? But there was more to this, I found out, than just flip humor. The names of the barges are from a science fiction novel called The Player of the Games. Just read the instruction. Of course, I Still Love You are the names of 2 starships in the book. But Musk was just getting started on how to tell the story of rockets, his rockets, to the world. The payload on the maiden flight of the Falcon Heavy was his personal Tesla, a 2008 $100,000 roadster. Now, the car here was equipped with 3 cameras that streamed back video after the launch on YouTube for 4 hours. And sitting in the driver's seat was a dummy astronaut named Starman, with his right hand on the steering wheel and his left elbow casually propped up on the door, listening to the music of David Bowie. Now, of course, as we know from the tagline of the movie Alien, no one in space can hear you scream or hear the music of Bowie. But in the glove compartment was a road map, a popular science fiction book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This has been declared the world's greatest car commercials. And Musk was able to double down on his fun by creating an event that promoted his car as well as his rocket company. And by the way, the space ride holds the world's record. This holds the record for being the second most watched television live stream event ever on YouTube. What's number 1? A performance by Beyonce. Okay. So, launching the Tesla with Starman was a brilliant stroke of imagination and marketing. And we know that some of the things that Musk has been saying about what he wants to do, that he must be smoking. And we do know that he has been smoking. Now, but he says he wants to make Mars possible in our own lifetimes. His ultimate goal is to make humans a multi-planetary species. He wants to send humans to Mars on a rocket that could hold 100 or more people, he says, and establish a colony there. And just as astronauts first went to the moon and back without landing, he has said that this possible that this could happen as early as somewhere around 2025. And he thinks a crew landing could happen in the middle of the 2030s. Now, a kind critic said, it's a vision, it's not a plan. Now, it may be a part of a marketing strategy to attract new talent to SpaceX. And I think it'd be pretty cool as a young engineer to go to work for a company that says it wants to make humanity a multi-planetary species. But bear in mind, while imagining a colony on Mars, Tesla is having a problem delivering its cars to customers, and SpaceX is several years behind schedule with its Dragon spacecraft. So from what I gather from press reports, NASA doesn't seem very happy about all of this, at least the latter part. Now, let's get a little more down to earth, and talk about Mars, about space and the human imagination, and realize how many people are willing, waiting, having shelled out money, patiently standing by for a joyride into space. Folks, space is still a very dangerous place. You can get yourself killed there. And Blue Origin is selling now a trip that is supposed to work for about, I think 12 minutes on a joyride, straight up and straight down. And Jeff Bezos is spending something like, I don't know, out of his, he's worth, I think, over $100 billion, the richest man on the planet. And he's selling these tickets. 6 people can go on each ride for $300,000 per person. That's about $2 million gross for each flight. And he's got underway also the ideal of a rocket called the New Glenn is to make payloads into Earth orbit and take people into Earth orbit. And then beyond that, he's got a lunar lander they call the Blue Moon. Very clever, these billionaires. Now, also, of course, Richard Branson's been in the ideal of space tourism way before anyone. And he says he has 600 people from 60 countries lined up to go to the edge of space for $250,000 per ride. Because his takes off from, more like a plane, that this ride is a little longer. It takes about 2 hours in total, but only about 6 minutes of zero G. This man is the first space tourist, former JPLer and now billionaire, Dennis Tito. He got a bargain back in 2001. He paid a reported $20 million for a seat on the Soyuz and got to spend an entire week aboard the space station. Now, Russia's space agency says it now wants to resume selling seats. And they have a program, you can go and you see this on the web, that they have a program to fit whatever your budget is as to what you could do on the station. And the options include even taking a spacewalk with an experienced guide. Pretty crazy, the imagination. So Elon Musk, not to be outdone, says that when it comes to space tourism, he wishes to put the first private passenger into space. He's already identified who it shall be. It's another billionaire, a fashion designer from Japan, who says that he will take on his trip 8 artists to fly around the moon in 2023. Yes, 2023. That's 3 years from now. So who knows? If you can imagine it, you can do it. If it started with a mouse for Disneyland, who knows what Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, NASA, the rest of the world's space agencies can do. It's certainly going to be a very interesting time ahead. Buckle up. I can't wait to see what happens next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Blaine. That was really fascinating. Do we have questions? We have a roving microphone.
Okay. All right.
Okay, I'm going to ask one while people warm up. So, I was inspired as a kid by the Apollo program and also by the movie 2001. And I felt a lot of people of my generation were also inspired by that feeling we're going to conquer space. And then it seemed to have taken a dip during the shuttle program. Do you think that was a lack of storytelling, that was not marketed the right way?
I think what was lost with the exception of Sally Ride, was the human aspect of the astronaut corps. The focus turned to the shuttle itself and away from the human aspect of this. And I believe it was a major public relations, marketing, call it what you will, mistake, not to spend more time with the astronauts. Now, it's easy to say that when there are only 7 Mercury astronauts to profile them, as opposed to the large corps that they now have. But I think for some reason NASA missed a beat in not spending more time telling their stories, which is why I love the story, particularly of Scott Kelly, and I use him. He is very candid and tells it like it is, and it makes for a story of which you feel like you're going along with him on his ride. And that's what we need, is for us to feel as the public, members of the public, is that we are experiencing what they're experiencing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any others?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, Greg.
Hey, Greg.
So the Apollo program ended because the public started losing interest, and therefore it was very difficult to justify the funding. And somebody asked Jim Green a while back, how much is it going to cost to send humans to Mars? And as a student of the history of all of these times, Blaine, do you think that things have changed sufficiently today that the population of this and other countries really would support the immense cost to get humans to Mars? Or is it going to have to be done strictly by the commercial folks because we can't get governments to get their populace to stand behind it and provide the money that they need to provide?
Okay, well, clearly, as from what I've been saying, there's this huge push on the commercial side by these billionaires who, they're not all idealistic. I mean, Elon Musk is working, launching satellites for the Defense Department intelligence. He's not just in the space tourism business or NASA and ferrying things. But the fact that we have these pushes by these very wealthy people, combined with the fact that now we are not in a space race, we're in a situation where we can have collaboration with other countries. With a space agency of NASA wanting to go to these places again, I think it can work. I think we can make it happen. And we have new technologies. So all of those combined, I believe, make it a good time to go back to the moon. Whether we go back in 2024 or a few years later, I don't think it's important. That path is, we go to the moon, we learn how to live there before we go to Mars. We make our mistakes at the moon where we can get back quickly.
And we have time for one last question.
Hi Blaine, it's Michelle. Hi, love
Michelle.
All of your films. If you had one film that you could have full access to do, one last space film, what would it be for you?
One that I have not done?
One you have not already done.
I think because I'm working on all these films about JPL for everybody else here, what I think I need to do, a final film in my career, is look at what's happened at Mars in more detail. How the incredible devotion and dedication of the people who have made missions like Curiosity happen needs to be told from the inside that we don't normally get. That's what I hope to do. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.